I muted mine. All right. So when I started this project, I was probably like most of you. I heard various stories about rum running, and most of the stories involved unnamed local residents sneaking alcohol from offshore boats. And what happened to the liquor after it came ashore was never really specified, but some people said, well, of course it went to the local restaurants and bars. And rum running is one of those topics that's wonderfully mysterious, so of course I really couldn't resist looking into it. And I was really surprised by the complexity of the topic. But before we begin, let's have a quick clarification of vocabulary. For the purposes of this talk, rum running is the movement of alcohol across the water, and bootlegging is the transportation of alcohol on the land. I, like everybody else, occasionally gets it mixed up, so don't be surprised if I accidentally use the wrong terminology there. All right, being a historian, you're going to have to suffer through history lessons first, okay? So from very early in history, mankind realized that sometimes water was really dangerous to drink. Egyptian wall tombs show that some of the earliest images of man making alcohol are brewers making beer. And this image is from the Met. It's from the Old Kingdom Dynasty 5, and it shows brewers and bakers from about 2000 BC. That's the end of that one. Okay. Since the process of making beer kills bacteria, men, women, and children commonly drank mildly alcoholic beverages such as small beer, which is the equivalent to some of our modern light beers today. Drinking was so ingrained in society that one of the earliest definitions of a grocery store was as a groggery or a saloon. Many store owners capitalized on the social functions of their enterprise by providing alcoholic and non-alcoholic beverages for sale by the bottle for home consumption or by the glass for immediate gratification. So during the 19th centuries, Americans made a differentiation between wine, beer, and all other alcoholic beverages. Beer and wine regularly drunk in an adult's diet was considered to be benign. Other forms of alcohol, such as rum and brandy, are considered to be intoxicants. So by the 1830s, drinking is a well-established social ritual, and scroll machine. And the average adult in the United States consumed between 4 and 7 gallons of alcohol a year. In comparison, in the 1970s, the average adult only had approximately 2.5 gallons of alcohol a year.
Really?
So needless to say, our ancestors were pretty pickled. So beginning with the beer-drinking Germans in the 1820s and moving to the 1850s with the potato famine Irish Catholic refugees, Americans began to fear what was seen as a foreign alcohol-swilling masses that were flooding our country. These newcomers not only came from different cultures, but they drank different types of alcohol. Many feared that these newcomers would not only take away jobs, but they would drink away their wages and abandon the welfare of their large families on the backs of hard-working Americans. These foreign attitudes towards drinking would then infect the innocent young men of the country, and we would end up being a nation of drunkards. These fears were mixed in with the sermons of ministers stating that drinking led to moral decline, poverty, it could damage our health, and these mixtures of fear not only threw support to the temperance movements, but also to the anti-immigration organizations. And we can see the young man here climbing the steps towards moral decline and rolling down the other side. So while the temperance movement started in the 1820s, it wasn't until around the Civil War in the 1860s that the movement really began to gain popular support. By the 1870s, movements like the National Christian Temperance Union, the Women's Christian Temperance Union, Washingtonian Sons of Temperance swelled across the nation, and the movement took a hold to various degrees across the country. In places like Orient, which is on the far east end of the North Fork, the population had more of a religious bent, so temperance for them was a very natural fit, and people didn't drink there at all. Hey, listen. Despite the name, it was the goal of temperance organizations not to temper or limit the use of alcohol, but to prohibit it. And while the 18th Amendment to the United States Constitution prohibited the production, sale, and transportation of intoxicating liquors, it did not define what an intoxicating liquor was or provide penalties. The amendment gave the government the power to enforce the ban by appropriate legislation. So by 1917, America is sucked into World War I, and temperance supporters in Congress managed to insert language into an agricultural bill to ban the sale of liquor to soldiers. And in 1919, at the conclusion of the war, a bill was introduced into Congress. That bill, which the Anti-Saloon League helped to write, was named for Andrew Volstead of Minnesota. He's the chairman of the House Judiciary Committee, and we see him on the screen here. The Volstead Act was created to carry out the intent of the 18th Amendment, and it established prohibition. Enacted in 1920, the bill, while supported by many temperance members, really turned out to be a pain in the neck for the rest of us. So when you think about the Roaring Twenties in comparison to the centuries that came before it, the 1920s is a major revolution. Skirts, you're supposed to click here. Skirts shorten, women's hairstyles shorten, and attitudes about relationships and what can and cannot be done in public alter, and society begins to change pretty radically. For the first year, prohibition was regarded as an inconvenience. Most businesses that served alcohol either changed their business models, or in some cases, clubs and wealthy people had stored a large supply of alcohol in bondage warehouses, and technically, according to the law, they could keep drinking until their supplies went dry. Medical exemptions were offered to patients that doctors determined that alcohol would help their overall health. Yay, high blood pressure. But government monitored the number of these exemptions that were given out. And a drink known as near beer and wine, which had an alcohol content of 2 3/4% remained legal. So people in the US started to get very thirsty. And a number of people began to make booze in their home, like my maternal grandfather, for home consumption. But others saw a bigger, more commercial way to cater to the growing thirst. And we have a cat and mouse game start between the government and the owners of a new type of business, the speakeasy. And if we're on the east end of Long Island, we would call the speakeasy a blind tiger. And just as an aside, if you were in Detroit, it's called a blind pig. Why, I have no idea, but that's what the nickname was. Did you ever think about where liquor comes from? Well, in the 1920s, we import most of our hard liquor from Canada, Bermuda, Scotland, and France, as well as a number of other countries. So understandably, prohibition affected not only America, but also the international beverage industry. And businessmen seeing a new but rapidly growing market set about filling the need. At first, it was really easy to smuggle in a crate or two, and then the government creates the Prohibition Unit. And they took task the Department of the Treasury to work with the Coast Guard to enforce the law. So now our story starts to take a darker turn. One of the laws of business states that when there's a need, someone's going to step up, fill that need, and make a buck, right? So prior to Prohibition, New York City's criminal element consisted of street gangs who ruled over their own small neighborhoods. And Prohibition changes all of that. This man you see here is Arthur Rothstein. He is the black sheep of a wealthy German Jewish family from the Upper West Side. And as a teenager, he worked as a translator between immigrants and Tammany Hall. Rothstein is a gambler. He's 38 years old, and he soon sees the need created by Prohibition. He provides the financing for several gangs to purchase and import ships of booze. And his crew's organized the ships to anchor off of Long Island shores, but they also gathered the drivers, the vehicles to ship the crates up to the city. And while it still sounds like a game, ducking the law, these gangs were deadly serious about their business venture. Thousands of dollars changed hands with every single shipment. To give you an idea of what I mean when I say big business, the gang took in an estimated $12 million a year in this business. On average, they paid $200 a week to 100 employees when the average store clerk would take home $25 a week.
Wow.
They paid $100,000 a week in graft to the police, federal agents, city and court officials, and still netted $12 million. But give you even better perspective, a can of coffee, 5 pounds of coffee, 35 cents. That's a lot of money, right?
Back then, yes.
This is Arthur Simon Flegenheimer. He's better known as Dutch Schultz. He's born in New York City in 1902, and Schultz, like Rothstein, came from a German Jewish background. Schultz had a really violent temper, and he made his fortune in organized crime, particularly bootleggings and the numbers racket. He starts out in the Bronx as a small-time hoodlum, and then he's involved in the war for the city's beer supply, and he takes over control of the importation of booze across Long Island. Joining him in this particular endeavor, we have Waxy Gordon, Jacob Little Orgy Organ, Jack Legs Diamond, Salvatore Lucania, known as Charles Lucky Luciano, Meyer Sajal-Lansky, better known as Meyer Lansky, Francesco Castellia, better known as Frank Costello. There is also Joe Adonis, Vanny Higgins, Benjamin Bugsy Siegel. They're all part of the same group of importers working around the tri-state area. We only missed Al Capone because he moved to Chicago the year before Prohibition started, or he would have been part of this merry crew as well. I guess the names sound kind of familiar, huh?
Yeah, they do.
Yeah. Eventually, these gang members become the criminal enterprises we now know as the Italian, Jewish, and Irish mafias. In Southold, Ray Askin and Bob Gilbert were children during the 1920s, but they remembered some of these organized crime figures like Owie Madden, Two Fingers Genovese, Frank Costello, and their men lived in the area of Southold to help oversee the smuggling on the East End. Bob Gilbert remembers visiting the headquarters of the Rum Runners down the street and being allowed to shoot their automatic weapon. He goes, oh, I'm just a little nipper at the time, and it cost a lot of money to get one shell to put in my shotgun, so I would go down the street and they'd let me have an automatic weapon, and there was this post in the yard, and so I cut the post off. He was like 8, 9 years old when they were letting him do this. Fireflies didn't even start. So how did the rum running business work? Groups of investors from both sides of the ocean would buy shiploads of liquor. And they'd either deliver to a specific customer, or they'd have some on the ship and you would be able to go up to the ship and purchase a crate or a couple of bottles. These ships would anchor outside the territorial waters of the United States, which in 1920 was 3 miles off the coast. Later in 1924, they moved it, to make it a little bit more of a challenge, to 12 miles off the coast. The line of ships that were anchored there was known as Rum Row. So small, hopefully fast boats would go out to the larger boats, pick up or purchase a crate of liquor, and then run back to shore, hoping to avoid the Coast Guard's notice. Once on shore, the cargo would be transferred to either a vehicle for transportation to its final destination, or to be hidden locally until it was safe to move. The process of rum running was simple, and it was really easy to romanticize it, especially since the gangs weren't the only ones importing from overseas. However, remember, this is really big business for some very unsavory people. The ships that were anchored were periodically boarded by pirates who would rob and then kill everybody who was on board the ship. On shore, Dutch Schultz's gang hijacked and killed anyone whose vehicle they suspected of transporting a significant quantity of booze into the city. And that was just on the criminal side. On the federal government, in some instances, was just as violent as the gangs. And it authorized officers to stop, search, and detain anyone they suspected of violating the Volstead Act. The Prohibition Unit, which was first the arm of the Treasury, then became part of the Justice Department, along with the Coast Guard, was authorized to use deadly force to enforce the act. It's estimated nationwide several thousand innocent bystanders died while they enforced the act. So let me give you an example. You're driving home in your car, maybe in a meeting like this, and an unmarked car pulls up next to you. The guy is not in a uniform, but he says, "Pull over." If you hesitated or decided not to because you didn't like the way this guy looked, he had the right to kill you. And he would never be brought to justice because he was, in a word, untouchable. Oh, do you remember that old series, right? The Untouchables? That was the nickname for a lot of the Prohibition officers. So that's a lot of background. If you, even in passing, have heard about rum running, you've heard about people such as Bill McCoy and his rum running business. And he is one of the people who was anchored off our coast. However, please realize that the rum runners actually landed their small ships all over Long Island. And the general goal was to move the booze from outside the territorial waters up to New York City. So there are stories from not only the North Fork, but the South Fork, as far west as Huntington, Patchogue, Port Jefferson, Freeport, Long Beach, even Sandy Hook, New Jersey, all have rum running stories. Eventually, the gangs realized that landing the cargo on the East End and running it up west was riskier than trying to sneak the cargo directly into New York City. But since I'm a historian of Southold, my examples of places where you could get a drink if you were so inclined are, of course, all of Southold. So you're going to have to suffer through the Southold part here. So, Speakeasy, the Blind Tigers, here are some of the places where you could go get some hooch. We have the Spot of Southold on Ackerley Pond Road. At one point, Ackerley Pond Road was actually nicknamed Broadway because it was so busy with traffic going up and down to the Spot. The owner of this house, which still stands, was not very happy with this identification because at that point he was trying to sell the house. And along with getting a drink, you could go to the Spot, and there were some ladies who were working the crowd. And that was really making him upset. We have the Worthwhile Lodge in Peconic up by Goldsmith's Inlet. There was drinking and dancing. Moral decline. Lake Lodge, also up by Peconic by Goldsmith's Inlet. And both of those places are now private houses, but still stand. We also have the Old Mill in Mattituck, which had a trap door in the floor where boats could pull up under the building and pass the crates of booze directly up to the bar. As far as I know, rum running boats were twice mentioned in passing in the area, but the Old Mill was never, ever raided. I don't know who they paid off on that one. Everybody knows Claudio's Greenport, right? Yeah, everybody knows Claudio's. The second floor of what is now Bruce's was also reputed to be a blind tiger, as well as having a stage. And the last time I visited, which must be about 10 years ago now, the stage was still there right underneath those 4 windows in the front of the building. So now some of the fun stuff. There are a number of stories about rum running, and you're going to hear some of them. Some of the stories are a little bit on the long side. I'm sorry, but I like them, so you have to suffer. Okay? One thing to remember, the Volstead Act was enforced by the federal government, not by the local law enforcement. So in many of Long Island's shoreline communities, the local police were just as involved in the smuggling as the residents. Okay? And I encourage your historical society to collect the stories from you if you have any stories about rum running in your area. Patchogue Police Captain William H. Valentine must have radiated a sense of authority that affected all that surrounded him. As he was walking down the street in Patchogue, a car whizzed past him, and bellowing at the driver to stop the car brought instant results. As Joseph Powell of Islip jammed on the brakes and pulled over, Valentine, who merely wanted Powell to slow down, caught up with the car, and probably intended on giving him a lecture about the virtues of slowing down when in the community. However, he noticed there was a blanket covering something in the back seat. So he flipped up the blanket, and there were 12 cases of liquor, and of course, Powell's arrest. Archimamic in Southold, Sheriff Asmer Biggs was a dedicated lawman. He was a resident of Huntington, and Biggs became fascinated with law enforcement when he got to know the local sheriff, who would come to his livery stable to rent carriages and horses. By 1908, Biggs decided he needed to change of careers, so he sells off his stable and he joins local law enforcement as a deputy sheriff. On Sunday, June 17, 1923, Biggs learned about a boatload of whiskey that had been landed on the dock in Greenport at 2 in the morning. The tip made no mention whether or not the booze had been stashed or it had been transported. That same night, Sidney Smith at Greenport was unable to sleep, and he went out for a late night stroll on a quiet Sunday, enjoying the peace. As he passed the property of fisherman Captain Fred Davis, he saw a woman going into the house. The doors soon opened again, and a very unfriendly Davis appeared with a shotgun and fired at Smith, striking him in the face and the ear with shotgun pellets. Injured and aggrieved, Smith notified Sheriff Biggs of the incident, and a warrant was quickly issued, and Biggs arrived with a group of deputies to begin observing the property. After a short while, the deputies spotted Ernest Martin of Hempstead, John Monahan, and William Calverser of Greenport driving an Eastern Auto Supply Company truck off of the property. And when the truck was stopped by the deputies, it was found to be filled with crates of liquor, and Biggs suspected that the truck only had a portion of the haul that was landed on the dock. So he said to his guys, "Keep watching." The next evening, an estimated 60 to 70 professional gunmen from New York City, who were heavily armed, arrived at Fred Davis's house. These newcomers then faced down the 8 deputy sheriffs, and they were powerless to prevent the removal of about 600 cases of Scotch and rye liquor from the barn that was on the property. Clarence Downs of Sag Harbor and a group of friends narrowly escaped death when a gunman protecting a gang of bootleggers and rum runners confronted Downs and his friends. The group was heading home from a visit to Montauk when the driver made a wrong turn on Devon Road and was heading down towards the beach in Amagansett. As soon as they realized their mistake and they were looking for a place to turn around, Downs and his friends realized that they were in a really bad situation. A group of men with guns soon spotted them and began to brandish their weapons. And when one of the gunmen leaped onto the running board of the car and began to smash the window of the car with his gun, the men were sure they were never going to see another sunrise. The driver hastily backs out, turns around, and races the car back down the road towards Montauk Highway, but leaving wasn't good enough. The gunman leaped into what was called a high-powered Marmon car and followed, shooting at the fleeing automobile. When the car carrying Downs reached the turnoff, they tried to take the turn at a high rate of speed, and they flipped their auto 3 times before coming to a rest. Although the car was demolished, the occupants surprisingly only had minor injuries. And the gunman, after witnessing the accident, probably assumed that the passengers were dead because they turned around and went back to their posts. Locals noticed later on that 7 large trucks loaded with liquor left various points of East Hampton town, each heading towards the city, and all of those trucks were escorted by several cars carrying armed guards. As the net to capture bootleggers tightened, the methods of smuggling contraband liquor across Long Island become increasingly elaborate. Prohibition agents Smith and Phelps got a tip that a cargo of booze had been landed 2 weeks earlier and was going to be moved fairly soon. The haul was packed into 7 cars, and it was moved as far west as Eastport when word came down that the officers had been alerted and were searching cars. So the lead driver quickly turns around and goes back to Sag Harbor, and he hides his prize. Stymied in their search for the elusive load of liquor, Smith and Phelps spent some time idly looking at a green Ajax motor oil truck. The men had heard a story that a tanker had recently been used to slip a load of booze into the city. Searching for an alternative method of transportation, the lead driver of the illicit cargo also spotted a green tanker truck emblazoned with Ajax motor oil. Thinking to disguise the truck as a legitimate business that worked all across Long Island, he purloins the tanker. And he paints the truck red, and he writes Haviland Crude Oil across the side. He then reloads his cargo, and he sets out. About a mile east of Lake Grove on Middle Island Road, the truck's pulled over by the officers, who say, "Hey, buddy, can you give us a hand? We think we're out of gas." He goes, "Oh, yeah, sure. I've got a little carton of gas behind the driver's seat here. I'll pour it in for you." So he goes back to the police officer's car. He pours it in, and he says, "You know something? I think you got a half a tank of gas in here." And he goes, the police go, "Oh, well, maybe our feed tank is stopped up. I mean, we thought we were out." So the police are meanwhile walking around the tanker truck, but they couldn't find anything wrong, so they let the driver and the tanker go. But they stand there and they're comparing notes, and one of the guys said, "Did you notice that guy had red paint on his overalls?"
Oh, no.
And they were, uh-oh. So they chase down the trucker again, and they pull him over, and they arrest him this time. This time they managed to get into the tanker, and inside the tanker was 125 cases of liquor. Now, this is a truck from that year for home heating fuel. How anyone managed to stuff 125 cases of liquor in there, I have absolutely no idea. However, there you go. 1924, the sloop Elizabeth Wilson of Greenport was brought to New London by the Coast Guard destroyer Jewett. Having been seized off of Block Island with a small quantity of whiskey hidden in a very large cargo of codfish, can you imagine how much fish that the sailors probably had to move to find just 2 or 3 bottles at the bottom of it? I like to tell this story because what we see here is one of the Coast Guard boats that was chasing rum runners. It's a lot bigger than what I thought it would be. And one of the problems the Coast Guard had when they started chasing the smaller boats is they were seriously outclassed in speed and maneuverability. To the point that the Coast Guard eventually starts to absorb some of the rum runners' boats into their fleet just to try and keep up. In order to more successfully cope with the rum running, the federal government actually establishes a floating base in Greenport Harbor. And as the County Review newspaper account observes, it would appear that the government's planning to exert every effort to stop the rum running on eastern Long Island, but it is a fact that the abundance of liquor being brought ashore from the ships anchored outside the 12-mile limit, and the rum running boats are having very little difficulty eluding the patrols. It's reported that prominent businessmen on eastern Long Island have made fortunes during the past year financing these boats engaged in rum running. 1925. Lloyd Hamilton and Edward Coleman, along with their girlfriends, go up to Bailey's Beach in Montauk by the breakwater at 10:30 night on a date. Hubba, hubba. Hearing a boat that sounded like it was run aground, they shouted out asking, "Do you need help?" Somebody in the boat said yes. So the couples go to Peter Wyckoff's house to get a third man to help move a boat that was aground. When they returned to the beach all ready to help, what later turned out to be a Coast Guard patrol boat opens fire on them, on the 3 men and 2 women with their machine gun. The 3 men from the boat then came ashore in the dory and began to shoot blindly around them with revolvers. Luckily, nobody was killed.
Wow.
The Coast Guard had been ordered to Mattatuck Creek to intercept a rum running vessel, and they later claimed that they believed that they were being fired upon by somebody on the shore. Hamilton, who returned the the next day to the scene of the crime to get his car said he saw stacks of liquor on the Coast Guard boat. So, who's smuggling that? In August, the Coast Guard base moves to Nantucket because they felt they had the east end of Long Island under control. Hans Furman of Greenport and his friends found a new and exciting way to make money. And best of all, every time they went to work, they had access to a lot of booze. Unfortunately for Hans, while he made a good salary, he was drinking his paycheck away as quickly as he earned it. And not everybody was happy with this particular situation. Hans's wife, Annie, was more disgruntled than most because her husband usually returned from these voyages not only drunk, but also broke. She couldn't pay the household expenses. So rather than nag and argue with her husband about his habits of drinking away his paycheck, Mrs. Furman decides to go to the source. She contacts his boss, and she says to him, just give me part of the paycheck. I don't need the whole thing, just part of it, please. Annie said that their reply was, they laughed and said it was my funeral. So, well, I wanted to make it their funeral too. Annie, realizing that the best way to hurt the rum runners was to hurt them financially. So she wrote to a reporter at the Brooklyn Daily Eagle and she said, I need help because I want to get some of the government officials' ears. Soon the Prohibition Enforcement Bureau from the Department of Justice sends a special undercover investigator to hear Mrs. Furman's case. Mabel Willebrandt, the U.S. Assistant Attorney General, who is in charge of handling all of the prohibition cases in the U.S., becomes involved in this. Annie Furman began to work for the government investigation, telling them everything she knew about their operation. And when she learned that her husband had been incarcerated again for violating the Volstead Act, she closes up her house and she moves to Brooklyn. There she's reunited with her husband and she convinces him to turn state evidence. Furman begins to tell everything he knew about the operation of his employers. They had meetings at the house in Greenport. They told them how the leaders used temporary bases to plan, hire, and how they paid their employees. They provide the authorities with names, addresses, and a wealth of details. So much so that the government puts her on payroll and they pay all of her expenses in the time that she's in Brooklyn. The information on the Furmans led to raids on the headquarters of the smuggling ring, which was in the Longacre and in the Knickerbocker buildings in New York City, and the surrender of the leader of the ring, Arthur Kraus. During the raid, Hans Furman stood with a group of officers, and as each member of the syndicate was arrested, they were brought out to the group, and Furman would identify them by name and their occupation. 6 months later, Hans Furman is found dead with a bullet to the head, and nobody ever caught the murderer. A Pierce Arrow pulls up to a stop at a hotel in Smithtown, and the driver who's hungry wanders inside for a bite to eat. Upon learning that one of the hotel guests, Patrick McInerney, was going to catch the train to Brooklyn, he invites him, oh, don't do that. I'm heading that way. You can catch a ride with me. Patrick probably soon began to wonder about his good fortune as the driver began to accelerate down the road, going faster and faster and faster. Just west of Huntington, the Pierce Arrow pulls out into opposing traffic to pass a slower moving vehicle and smashes into Patsy Mastriani, who's driving home to Huntington with his mother and nephew. The Pierce Arrow overturns and the front end tears off, while Mastriani's car was almost ripped in two by the force of the impact. Surprisingly, nobody was killed, and the driver of the Pierce Arrow, after a moment of shock, quickly recovers his wits. He crawls out of the car and begins to run backwards towards Huntington. There he flags down two other Pierce Arrows, both loaded with crates of booze, and crawls into one of the vehicles, leaving Patrick still stunned in the wrecked car. People who stopped soon began to smell the odor of scotch, which perfumed the air. Apparently wedged out of sight between the front and the back seat was 20 cases of liquor, of which 125 bottles managed to survive the accident. Officials later imparted that they believed that the Rune Pierce Arrow and its driver were part of an 18-man hijacking crew that was working the Huntington area. In February 1930, the Coast Guard got a call from a beam trawler, the Notice, which was in distress in the South Forks Oyster Pond. The Coast Guard captain, Frank Warner, immediately went to investigate, and the ship, along with Adolf Steinfeld, who was the owner and captain, was beached in about 4 feet of water. After searching the ship, he found it completely empty of all illegal cargoes. But Warner's a very suspicious man. So he decides, I'm going to arrest Steinfeld anyway. And he calls New London to have the Notice taken into custody and towed into port. Later that afternoon, 2 Coast Guard ships, the Eagle and the Nemaya, arrived. And the crew from the Eagle was ordered to get into the February's freezing water to start searching for the cargo that Warner was sure had been on the Notice. Soon the men begin to bring up bags of liquor. Bags and bags of liquor. A total of 330 out of an estimated 400 sacks were found and brought to shore. As word of the Coast Guard men searching the water spread, a crowd of residents armed with clam rakes, eel spears, and nets begin to appear along the roadway. They're all set to help, trying to find the cargo. As the residents begin to approach the beach, all set to collect whatever they could, the Coast Guard patrol turns their guns on the crowd. William Petty, who was among the crowd, along with Richard Bennett, Kenneth King, and Arnold Paulson Algaro, said that the officer of the patrol stated, as the Coast Guard men got into their boats, "You people, get behind the bank there and stay. We're going to spray the shore with machine gun fire if you move." Petty said, "We thought he was bluffing." So we ran down to the beach, and all of a sudden there was noise like a lot of hornets, and the sand and water began spitting up. We got out of there quick. The Coast Guard did begin to spray the beach in front of the crowd with machine gun fire, and anyone, including curiosity seekers, who attempted to move past the hills of the beach towards the water was shot at.
Wow.
This quickly brought complaints from the crowd to the Sheriff's Department. And when the deputy sheriff spoke to the Coast Guard official who was in charge of ships about the shooting, the officer declined to comment. The Coast Guard agents, like Prohibition agents, were, in a word, untouchable. Owning waterfront property near the dock is not as pleasurable as you imagine, and I know you imagine it would be great, but it's not. John Crampton and his family had their home in the water near Bishop's Dock in Patchogue. For months, the Cramptons had been working really hard to ignore the regular delivery that came at night made at the dock next to the house. Then in December, the police got a tip-off about a cargo and stopped one of the waterborne deliveries. A short while later, New Year's Eve, Crampton, who was entering his yard after a late night, was surprised when 2 men with guns appeared and ordered him to leave and not to come back for a while. He then noticed there was a boat docked near the shore, and he said, "Listen, I just want to get into my house. I'm not going to say anything. I don't see anything. I just want to get in the house." 5 days later, another large boat appears, and men swarm around his property. Hunkering down the house, Crampton and his family worked really hard in not seeing anything, even though they recognized some of the local men who were helping to unload the boat. But the gang was taking no chances. The telephone lines to the house were cut, and a day or two later, the family received in the mail an envelope posted from New York City. Inside was a newspaper clipping about an article about a bombing that happened on an informant in New Haven, Connecticut. In the margin, written in blood, was the message Crampton would also get a pineapple, known as a bomb, and he better keep his mouth shut. Frightened and distressed with the threats, Crampton quickly packed his family off to stay elsewhere, and he went to the police and the district attorney's office to plead for protection and assistance with this situation. It must have been resolved because there was never another word ever written about Crampton and his family. November 24th, 1930, 2 a.m. District Attorney Alexander Blue was roused from his bed by a message that 2 of his undercover agents sent word that 3 trucks were going to be loaded at the Timber Point Club in Great River. Unable to contact any Prohibition agents, he then cobbled together a small posse of his assistant attorney, Joseph Arriata, Deputy Sheriff Albert Kellenbeck, and 2 undercover men. They approached the club's driveway, and Blue and his men could see there was a caravan led by a large sedan turning onto the highway. They stopped their car, they stepped out into the road and called for the sedan to stop. The bootlegger instead gunned his engine and raced towards the men. Deputy Sheriff whistled and repeated his order to stop, and the driver aimed his car at Blue and stopped harder on the accelerator. At the very last moment, Blue leaped out of the path of the car, and behind the first car was a second vehicle, which aimed at the officer on the other side of the road. The cars were soon followed by a volley of shots and then the 3 fully loaded trucks. A third car followed the trucks and aimed itself at Arriata and Kellenbeck, both of whom managed to leap onto the running board of the fleeing car. Arriata slammed a blackjack into the driver and gained control of the car and stopped it. After ordering the passengers out of the vehicle, Arriata slid behind the wheel, Blue jumps into the front seat, and Kellenbeck gets into the back, and then start roaring down Great River Road towards Montauk Highway. Soon they overtook one of the trucks, and as they neared East Islip, Arriata tried to head the truck off. But as they drew level with the truck driver, Blue yelled at him to pull over, and the truck driver then swerved to try and force them off the road. Maneuvering behind the truck, another car with more bootleggers raced up behind the officials and opened fire and rammed the back of Arriata's car. The cars briefly got together, and Arriata, straining, managed to regain control and continued to chase the fleeing truck. However, the bootleggers in the car were not deterred and opened fire again on the officials. Blue and Kellenbeck then whipped out their pistols and leaned out the windows and started returning fire. So the gun battle continues as the vehicles flew through Main Street in Islip. Realizing there was no way to win the situation, Blue said to Arriata, "Get around the truck and head to Bayshore." As the car passed the trucker again tried to run them off the road. As soon as the trio made it to the state police headquarters in Bayshore, they leaped out and raced to the doors of the building, and the bootleggers in the car who had followed them sprayed the men with bullets as they went by. After rounding up 8 state troopers, the group headed back to the country club to try and pick up the trail. Instead, they found 5 men who admitted to loading the trucks and 2 men whose car Blue and his men commandeered. All 7 were arrested and were soon released due to lack of evidence. So Blue was left with almost nothing to show for his night's adventure. Even the car that they had commandeered had stolen license plates. So it ended any chance they had of tracking down this murderous ring. So while most of the alcohol that was captured and reported in the newspapers on Long Island came by ship from other countries, Federal Agent Wilbur, who was in Huntington, received a tip that not far from the commercial district of the community, there was a garage on Wall Street that had a large still set up. Gathering Deputy Sheriff Asmund Biggs and his officers, the authorities quietly approached the suspected site, and they surprised 3 men who were operating a huge distilling plant. They got a crew of Prohibition wreckers who were dispatched to dismantle the 2,000-gallon still and to destroy the rest of the plant. They found 48 barrels of booze in the basement of an adjacent house, which they emptied, while the cans of liquor waiting to be shipped were taken by officials as evidence. Angelo Ulino, the owner of the property, and 5 other men connected to the operation were arrested. And what we see here is not Ulino and his still. Surprisingly, most people in the past had the common sense not to be photographed or filmed themselves doing illegal acts, unlike in today's world. Some stories collected by the Oyster Ponds Historical Society in Orient. Joseph Dorowski related to a friend that when he was 18, some guys came to him after school and offered him cash to go to Browns Hill. There were no houses up there then. And a boat would land there at night, and a whole bunch of guys would then line up from the beach up the hill, and they'd pass the crates of liquor. But that particular night, all of a sudden, the whole hill lit up, and they heard a Coast Guard ship saying, "Stop what you're doing and don't move." Dorowski said when he heard the machine gun, he took off running to his father's house, and he crawled into the barn and stayed there the rest of the night, and he never got paid for the job. Scrolling me. One of my favorite stories that I heard in passing was not so much about bringing liquor ashore from the Rum Row, but about the Hedges Barn, which is in East Marion. It was located on Bay Avenue, and Henry Hedges and his sister ran a duck and chicken farm. Their barn, they incubated chicks and had a number of gurgling pipes overhead that served a dual purpose. Not only did it keep the barn warm for the incubators, but it also connected to the whiskey still that was in the back room. 1931. On a quiet August night, the Artemis, a fast speedboat from Greenport, was sighted by the Coast Guard off of Orient Point at midnight. The Artemis was somewhat typical of a rum runner. It was 52 feet long with 3 Liberty engines. The ship could do 45 knots, which in landlubbers terms is about 51 miles on the water. And when ordered to stop by the Coast Guard, the Artemis sped up, hoping to outrun its pursuers. The patrol boat opened fire and shot more than 100 rounds into the fleeing ship. At least 30 to 40 of them struck the Artemis and 2 of her crew. John Johnson and Captain Carl Ryder, both at Greenport, were wounded in the onslaught. The Artemis, after enduring the barrage of bullets, turned and rammed the Coast Guard cutter, crippling it on the port side, before escaping the patrol and landing on the beach in Orient. They then scrambled to get help for their wounded comrades, and the crew woke up 2 nearby neighbors to take Johnson and Ryder up to the hospital. According to the reports, Johnson had been shot in the head, and Ryder had taken 6 bullets to the body. The injured men were taken to Eastern Long Island Hospital, and the cargo of the Artemis was hastily unloaded and put into, some of it was put into 3 dories, which was later caught. Investigators, realizing that some of the crew must have been hit in the hail of bullets, went to the hospital and made inquiries. A very fast-thinking doctor saved Johnson and Ryder from the investigators, claiming, "Oh, those wounds are from a hunting accident that happened this morning. That's a hunting accident." The remaining crew moved the heavily damaged Artemis with the help of the fishing boat Evangeline quietly up the Sound to Port Jefferson. In this picture of Port Jefferson, you can just make out the boatyard among the jumble of buildings, right? Oh, come on. There's a ship. That's not the Artemis, but there's a ship for you in the boatyard. Prohibition officials had set investigators to watch the boatyards along the Sound, and William Philibach, a DA in Port Jefferson, spotted the ship at the Long Island shipyard in the harbor. And Philibach reported that the Artemis was a scene of chaos. The cabin was strewn with glass, one of the handles of the wheel had been shot away, and 9 machine gun bullets were counted in the windshield. 4 of them were directly behind the wheel, and both sides of the Artemis had been riddled with bullets. 3 planks on her port side for a distance of over 6 feet above the waterline had been stowed in. Philibach and 5 other deputy sheriffs guarded what remained of the boat, while authorities tried to figure out if they had the ability to confiscate a vessel that was in dry dock and did not have a drop of liquor on it anywhere, but they could smell it in the air. Possession of the ship hung in limbo until mid-September, when the vessel was eventually seized for non-payment of a bill in the Greenport shipyards. The ship was then eventually rebuilt, and it ended up being a ferry to Fire Island. So if you ever took a ferry from about this area over to Fire Island, you may have ridden on the Artemis. Some young men from Watermill soon found out that bootlegging business was very dangerous. The organized crime factions, which were running the importation of alcohol in the East End, were intent on keeping very tight control on the business and doing away with competitors. There was a bitter feud that broke out between competing gangs working in Sag Harbor, East Hampton, and Southampton. June 1931, a group of young men are socializing late at night in Southampton when suddenly they're forced into a car at 1 o'clock in the morning. Herbert Miller and Mac McKee realized there was something really wrong, and they managed to escape the car before it started going down the road. William Kelly got away when the kidnappers pulled the car into some woods. And the 2 remaining youths, Thomas Farrell and Jacob Angeli, were dragged into an abandoned house on North State, and their kidnappers then proceeded to beat and torture them by branding them using a red-hot potato masher that was heated on an oil lamp. They used it on their faces, necks, hands, and feet. The assailants accused the young men of hijacking a load of liquor from their gang several nights earlier. At dawn, the pair were dumped at Southampton. Henry Field, Charles Walker, Frank Alford were charged with the crime. Joseph Stimson and Betty Mack, both from New Jersey, were held as possible accessories because they had rented the house where the group had been staying. Walker was later acquitted, and it's possible the gang managed to buy the silence of the two victims because during the trial, Thomas Farrell testified, "A large Filipino man did this to me." 1932, around and around Plum Island they went. The 55-foot liquor boat in the front and the 75-foot Coast Guard boat close behind. By its longest dimension, Plum Island is barely 3 miles long, and there's dangerous spots for navigation on all sides. And since it was night, neither of the boats could cut corners. All right, here we go. Ooh, sorry, the computer's like being mean to me now. Okay. The chase started when the Rum Runners boat came idling along, and when it got to the corner of Plum Island where Fort Terry was, it slid around the corner, and the Coast Guard boat said, "Wait a second, what's that guy doing?" And they followed and started chasing around and around and around. Eventually they slowed up and they allowed the Coast Guard boat to come aside and actually search them. There was no liquor on board. There had never been liquor on that board. What happened is it was a decoy boat. A second sailboat with 800 sacks of liquor were following along behind them, and it went the other way into Marine Corps to unload. And there we see Plum Island. So while the newspapers enjoyed dedicating space breathlessly to reporting on the capture of the various bootleggers and rum runners, rarely did they ever dedicate space to the closure of speakeasies that were found in the county. However, early May 1931, Prohibition officers headquartered in Bayshore turned their attention to these illegal bars. Orrin Meade, the lead enforcer in Suffolk County, had his men raid the former Yaphank Grange that we see here. There was a dance that was in progress, and under the fascinated gaze of the dancers, John Tanks, George Baker, who were partners and proprietors of the site, as well as former Special Constable John Bennett of Farmingdale, who was acting as a bartender, were all arrested when officials discovered 28 cases of beer and bottles of whiskey on the premises. In the basement of the hall, they discovered a distillery with vats of mash cooking. That was not the only dance the federal agents crashed that night. Later on, after breaking up the dance and distillery in Yaphank, they went to Medford Community Hall and arrested Ernest Hare for possession and sale of liquor. And then they went to Bohemia Hotel and arrested owner Cyril Chauvenac. So as you can tell, there are even more local stories about rum runners, from people finding suitcases with bottles of alcohol in the garage for ignoring rum running activity, to active participation in smuggling. On April 7, 1933, it's all over. Many historians credit Nelson Rockefeller with swaying public opinion enough to have politicians repeal Prohibition. And Prohibition, also known as the Grand Experiment, was done. And citizens across the United States breathed a big sigh of relief. Here are some of the books that I used in order to do the research for this. And of course, this is the book that I wrote based on it. So, does anybody have any questions?
What was the penalty for getting caught, you know?
Ooh, if you got caught rum running or bootlegging, they first would confiscate your, whatever your vehicle was, your boat or your car. You didn't get that back again. It would be sold at auction. And they would also, usually, you would get jail time, a couple of years.
Was the jail time right to get filled over? You know what I mean?
Well, you know, big business. A lot of these guys felt it was worth it. And you know, as long as you didn't roll over on the guy who was the leader, you usually, you know, played cards and had a good time. Yes?
Were there any women involved in rum running?
Yes, surprisingly there were. I believe it's in Bayshore. It was Isabel Prim was one of the local women who was very much into temperance and decided at a very young age, she was like 20, that she was going to join the Prohibition agents, which she did. There's a story where one of the rum runners on the dock, where she was snooping to see if somebody was bringing some booze in, mistook the wife of another rum runner for being Ms. Prim and pushed her in the water. There were a couple of women who did that. There's also, surprisingly, women who were involved in this from the KKK. The Klan apparently was very, well, there was a big faction of the Klan on Long Island that was very much into being dry. They didn't believe in alcohol. So what they were doing is they were aiding the Prohibition agents by lending out their families and their cars for them to do stakeouts. So, you know, if you didn't approve, it's like, here, honey, put the kids in the car. We're going to go on a stakeout tonight. Oy. So that was happening as well. Yes?
I know your concentration is Suffolk County and being, you know, by the water and stuff like that, and easily accessible by water. So, do you have any idea how rum running or booze happen in Middle America? I mean, it's landlocked. Where do they get their booze from?
Canada going through the Great Lakes. Have you been to the middle of the country?
I was born there.
All right, I was going to say there's not a lot there. Last time I went through Nebraska, it was all cows. Great state, the best steak I ever had, Nebraska. Oh,
There's
if you
people
go there.
and they drink.
Yeah, they do. Apparently, a lot of the Canadians are bringing across the border, and of course the Mexicans are bringing tequila and things like that up from the south. That's what Al Capone's concentrating on in Chicago. I understand they tried hard to patrol the borders along the northern area there, and you know it's going to get through. I actually was reading part of a story that the Seaman family, you know, Seagram 7 and all that, yeah, it got its start in Prohibition. They made a lot of money off of it. Doing some of like the some of the trader houses that used to be along the border, they were renovating those and using them. You got to look into it. There's all sorts of stories about it. Come on, Mr. Tester Monday, go ahead.
When these fast boats or speedboats would come into the bay with the load they picked up, probably offshore, it was noted that there were several spots, landing points, you know, even along this area.
Gazillions.
One of them at Conklin Point, right next to what's now the Robert Wilson Bridge. Did you ever hear of some of those spots right in this area?
I probably did. If someone got arrested, so this book is based on the newspaper accounts because I wanted to get the real story from a primary source rather than people's memories. I mean, there's a couple of different memories in the book, but I wanted the bulk of it to be, you know, actually what happened. I might have Conklin Point stuff in there. I'm not positive. If it got printed in the newspaper, I probably wrote it down. I wrote down just about every account on Suffolk County that I could find.
Right.
But as I was saying before, your historical society needs to sit down and do some oral interviews and get these stories from the locals before it all fades away. It was surprising that when the people in the 1960s were trying to catch the guys who were actually involved in this, to get them on tape, they wouldn't talk. They were still afraid they'd lose their houses and their cars and everything like that, even though Prohibition had been repealed. So there's very little. It's usually their children were the ones who were willing to talk later on about what happened.
The reason I asked,
Sure.
as boys, my brother and I were told by a caretaker on a property over there, right on the point of that, and they actually had a short canal that didn't connect directly to the bay. There was marsh grass there, and there was a dock at the end. So the story was those flat-bottom boats could be dragged quickly over the marsh grass and disappear from whoever was pursuing them, especially at night. And the dock was still there. There's a photograph on the historic aerials. The photograph was taken in 1953 when it was still there.
It sounds like the perfect place.
I mean, it's a good story, but I don't know how it can be verified.
I don't know if there probably isn't any way to verify it, but that's the kind of story that should be written down so people in the future will know, okay, here's a possibility where it could have happened. As I don't know if there's any written records other than newspapers of all the different tips they got from all the different places. I'll give you another story, a Greenport story. The reason why I wrote this book was because the Oyster Ponds Historical Society, as I was cataloging their stuff, I came across this little tiny pocket notebook, this big, and inside had a whole series of loose leaf pages that were typed. And I start reading it, and I'm like, wait a second, half a barrel of rum? What is this? It turns out that during Prohibition, a rum runner is being chased by the Coast Guard in Greenport Harbor. And they go right past the fishing boat of Samuel Borum. And as they pass, Borum, who's hauling in his nets, this little brown object comes flying out of the speedboat and lands in his net. So he just keeps pulling it in, and he takes a look, and he goes, oh my God, it's the list of all the codes the rum runners were using to signal each other, either by lights or however else. He's like, I'm gonna get killed. So he sticks it and hides it away in the house. The Borum family were Methodists. They didn't drink to begin with, so this was of no value to him. They passed it down in their family, and his grandson brought it to the Historical Society. He said, I don't know if you want this, but here's the story behind it. And I was like, oh my God. So I wanted to transcribe it, to put it out there for historians, that here are the codes that were actually used during rum running in our area. And I was talking to my friend Walter Jackson about it. He goes, that is the most boring book I've ever heard about it. That's really bad. And I went, what? He goes, codes, words, that's it. He said, you gotta put some stories to it. And I went, all right, I can put some stories to it. So I went to the publisher and I said, I want to do a book on rum running in Southold. And they said, not big enough. I went, rum running on the North Fork? They said, no, not big enough. They said, East End Navy? I went, how about all of Suffolk County? Why not? It's a great story. There's lots of stories out there. And that's how this book actually started. So in the book, in the back pages of the book, is actually a transcription of all codes. Now, those codes and the way rum running was, it's always to your advantage to know history, right? Because in the 1960s, we had a gentleman in Southold who decided he was going to import a very large quantity of pop. And he took all of those rum running stories, and that's how he structured his business. He would have boats drop the bales off of the offshore in Southold, and then he'd have divers bring them in and then run them forever. He eventually got caught. He's still doing time, but yeah, history can teach you a lot. Any other questions?
I know it's not Suffolk County, but what's like Guy Lombardo and Report and all of that? Is that?
I have no idea about Guy Lombardo's and Freeport. No, I do know that Hammerstein, Oscar Hammerstein, had an estate in New Jersey that he sold and was taken over by a bunch of rum runners syndicates, and they managed to have a huge operation where they came down on that house and a whole bunch of other houses over in Jersey, but I don't know. I'll have to look into Guy Lombardo. That's very interesting. Any other questions? Yes.
I was just wondering, did people not people, individually with these gangs, did they ever have stills making their own whiskey?
Some of them did. I understand that Schultz had a beer making operation set up in Port Jefferson. And there probably were others. It's just the ones that got busted were the ones that I found out about.
I know it's not bad brewing beer or wine, but
What do you mean not bad? All alcohol is prohibited at this point. All of it, unless it's
no,
like...
but whiskey, if it's done wrong, they end up be full of wood alcohol. That's the problem.
Well, okay,
That's poison.
so fake alcohol was being peddled to people. There were a couple of soldiers at Fort Terry who got a hold of some bad alcohol like that and ended up going blind. So it was a big danger. They would also bring in alcohol in concentrate in a barrel, and then when they got it here, they would rebottle it and water it down, and then they would paste whatever labels they happened to have on the front of it. You want secrets? Okay. You want vodka? Okay. So you got whatever.
Wow.
Anywhere in your research did you ever run across the cost of booze before, during, and after prohibition?
I did not look into that.
Okay.
I did not look into it. That is interesting, but I know the cost is in the book, and I can't remember what it is off the top of my head, but it had risen substantially. It was like, I want to say like $13 to $35 a bottle or something like that, which was pretty big money at that time, but I don't remember the numbers directly off my head.
Okay, just curious.
Sure. Yes, sir.
Joe Kennedy, it was rumored that he was involved in one.
Yeah.
His family won't admit it.
They won't admit it, and it was rumored he came to Southhold to try and hire people to do that kind of stuff, and there's no proof. There's no proof. I mean, they're rich enough to bury anything.
It's
So.
a great story.
It's a great story. It's a great story. It's kind of interesting thinking JFK may have got to the White House on booze money, but who knows? Who knows? Yes, sir.
These ships that came from, across the ocean and come hang out, were they contracted to bring alcohol over, or were they just hanging out there hoping that somebody would come and buy from them to take it back?
Both.
Okay.
You could actually contract a boat to bring over whatever you wanted. Say you want single malt, from Glenfiddich. You could contract a boat to bring that over. Glenfiddich might send a supply of it in a boat for if someone comes up to get it. So that was happening. That was what Bill McCoy was doing. He was buying rum in Bermuda and then just bringing it up. It got to the point where the Coast Guard was seizing these ships that these guys would either steal ships. There are cases where people went out for a sail for a day and disappeared forever because the pirates killed them and then stole their ships to run booze. But they was also getting down to the ships would make one run and then be abandoned towards the end because they were having problems hiring crews for a while. So what they were doing is they would get the ship loaded up, manage to get this crew with one guy who knew how to sail up to the international waters, and then as soon as they dispersed the thing, they would just all abandon ship and just let it float. So you would go out and you would find this ship, this nice sailboat or this ratty sailboat floating up to your dock with nobody on board.
Bill McCoy had the best quality, right? That's how it became.
He was known as the real McCoy, as the slang term, because he didn't water down or adulterate his alcohol. So he was known for quality. Not everybody else had that kind of reputation, but he did have that reputation. Any other questions? Okay, test on Monday. Yeah, one more.
Did
Okay.
anybody use Kentucky bourbon? I know it's more from that's not the
I have
same.
absolutely no idea. All I know is I can tell you that when you read the different things, there's cordials, there's champagne, there's scotch, there's rye whiskey, there's everything you can imagine. But I mean, Kentucky bourbon's down in Kentucky. I mean, how bootleggers managed to get up here, I couldn't tell you.
Yeah, that's the problem.
It's
You know,
mostly
the
the
truck
overseas
or
stuff.
Something else or cars.
Yeah, our area is all the overseas stuff. So, all right. I have, sure, I have a couple of books. If anyone wants to buy one.